Sections 71 and 72 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 71. These were days of world agony, when people bought the newspapers several times every day, and when crowds gathered in front of bulletin boards, looking at the big maps with little flags, and speculating, were the Germans going to get to Paris? Were they going to get to the Channel and put France out of the war? And then suddenly the Americans struck their first blow, and hurled the Germans back to Chateau Thierry, and all America rose up with one shout of triumph. You would think that was a poor time for pacifist agitation, but the members of the Anti-Conscription League had so little discretion that they chose this precise moment to publish a pamphlet describing the torturing of conscientious objectors in military prisons and training camps. Peter had been active in this organization from the beginning, and he had helped to write into the pamphlet a certain crucial phrase which McGivney had suggested. So now here were the pamphlets seized by the federal government, and all the members of the Anti-Conscription League under arrest, including Sadie Todd and little Ada Ruth and Donald Gordon. Peter was sorry about Sadie Todd, in spite of the fact that she had called him names. He couldn't be very sorry about Ada Ruth, because she was obviously a fanatic, bent on getting herself into trouble. As for Donald Gordon, if he hadn't learned his lesson from that whipping, he surely had nobody to blame but himself. Peter was a member of this Anti-Conscription League, so he pretended to be in hiding, and carried on a little comedy with Ada Ruth's cousin, an Englishwoman who hid him out in her place in the country. Peter had an uncomfortable quarter of an hour when Donald Gordon was released on bail, because the Quaker boy insisted that the crucial phrase which had got them all into trouble had been stricken out of the manuscript before he handed it to Peter Gudge to take to the printer. But Peter insisted that Donald was mistaken, and apparently he succeeded in satisfying the others, and after they were all out on bail, he made bold to come out of his hiding place and to attend one or two protest meetings in private homes. Then began a new adventure, in some ways the most startling of all. It had to do with another girl, and the beginning was in the home of Ada Ruth, where a few of the most uncompromising of the pacifists gathered to discuss the question of raising money to pay for their legal defense. To this meeting came Miriam Yankovich, pale from an operation for cancer of the breast, but with a heart and mind as red as ever. Miriam had brought along a friend to help her, because she wasn't strong enough to walk. And it was this friend who started Peter on his new adventure. Rosie Stern was her name, and she was a solid little Jewish working girl, with bold black eyes, and a mass of shining black hair, and flaming cheeks and a flashing smile. She was dressed as if she knew about her beauty, and really appreciated it. So Peter wasn't surprised when Miriam, introducing her, remarked that Rosie wasn't a Red and didn't like the Reds, but had just come to help her, and to see what a pacifist meeting was like. Perhaps Peter might help to make a Red out of her. And Peter was very glad indeed, for he was never more bored with the whining of pacifists than now when our boys were hurling the Germans back from the Marne and writing their names upon history's most imperishable pages. Rosie was something new and unforeseen, and Peter went right after her. And presently he realized with delight that she was interested in him. Peter knew, of course, that he was superior to all this crowd, but he wasn't used to having the fact recognized, and as usual when a woman smiled upon him, the pressure of his self-esteem rose beyond the safety point. Rosie was one of those people who take the world as it is and get some fun out of it, so while the pacifist meeting went on, Peter sat over in the corner and told her in whispers his funny adventures with Pericles Priam and in the temple of Jimjambo. Rosie could hardly repress her laughter, and her black eyes flashed, and before the evening was over their hands had touched several times. Then Peter offered to escort her and Miriam, and needless to say they took Miriam home first. The tenement streets were deserted at this late hour, so they found a chance for swift embraces, and Peter went home with his feet hardly touching the ground. Rosie worked in a paper box factory, and next evening Peter took her out to dinner, and their eager flirtation went on. But Rosie showed a tendency to retreat, and when Peter pressed her she told him the reason. She had no use for Reds. She was sick of the jargon of the Reds. She would never love a Red. Look at Miriam Yankovich, what a wreck she had made of her life. She had been a handsome girl, she might have got a rich husband, but now she had had to be cut to pieces. And look at Sadie Todd, slaving herself to death, and Ada Ruth with her poems that made you tired. Rosie jeered at them all, and riddled them with the arrows of her wit, and of course Peter in his heart agreed with everything she said. Yet Peter had to pretend to disagree, and that made Rosie cross and spoiled their fun, and they almost quarreled. Under these circumstances, naturally it was hard for Peter not to give some hint of his true feeling. After he had spent all of his money on Rosie and a lot of his time and hadn't gotten anywhere, he decided to make some concession to her. He told her he would give up trying to make a Red out of her. Whereupon Rosie made a face at him. "Very kind indeed of you, Mr. Gudge. But how about my making a White out of you?" And she went on to inform him that she wanted a fellow that could make money and take care of a girl. Peter answered that he was making money all right. Well, how was he making money? Asked Rosie. Peter wouldn't tell, but he was making it, and he would prove it by taking her to the theater every night. So the little duel went on, evening after evening. Peter got more and more crazy about this black-eyed beauty, and she got more and more coquettish and more impatient with his radical leanings. Rosie's father had brought her as a baby from Kishineff, but she was 100% American all the same, so she told him. Those boys in khaki who were over there walloping the Huns were the boys for her, and she was waiting for one of them to come back. What was the matter with Peter that he wasn't doing his part? Was he a draft dodger? Rosie had never had anything to do with slackers, and wasn't keen for the company of a man who couldn't give an account of himself. Only that day she had been reading in the paper about the atrocities committed by the Huns. How could any man with red blood in his veins sympathize with these pacifists and traitors? And if Peter didn't sympathize with them, why did he travel around with them and give them his moral support? When Peter made a feeble effort at repeating some of the pacifists' arguments, Rosie just said, "Oh, fudge! You've got too much sense to talk that kind of stuff to me." And Peter knew, of course, that he had too much sense, and it was hard to keep from letting Rosie see it. He had just lost one girl because of his Red entanglements. Was it up to him to lose another? For a couple of weeks they sparred and fought. Rosie would let Peter kiss her, and Peter's head would be quite turned with desire. He decided that she was the most wonderful girl he had ever known. Even Nell Doolin had nothing on her. But then once more she would pin Peter down on this business of his redness, and would spurn him, and refuse to see him any more. At last Peter admitted to her that he had lost his sympathy with the Reds. She had converted him, and he despised them. So Rosie replied that she was delighted. They would go at once to see Miriam Yankovich, and Peter would tell her, and try to convert her also. Peter was then in a bad dilemma. He had to insist that Rosie should keep his conversion a secret. But Rosie became indignant. She set her lips and declared that a conversion that had to be kept secret was no conversion at all. It was simply a low sham, and Peter Gudge was a coward, and she was sick of him. So poor Peter went away, heartbroken and bewildered. Section 72. There was only one way out of this plight for Peter, and that was for him to tell Rosie the truth. And why should he not do it? He was wild about her, and he knew that she was wild about him, and only one thing, his great secret, stood in the way of their perfect bliss. If he told her that great secret, he would be a hero of heroes in her eyes. He would be more wonderful even than the men who were driving back the Germans from the Marne, and writing their names upon history's most imperishable pages. So why should he not tell? He was in her room one evening, and his arms were about her, and she had almost but not quite yielded. "Please, please, Peter," she pleaded, "stop being one of those horrid Reds." And Peter could stand it no longer. He told her that he really wasn't a Red, but a secret agent employed by the very biggest businessmen of American City to keep track of the Reds and bring their activities to naught. And when he told this, Rosie stared at him in consternation. She refused to believe him. When he insisted, she laughed at him and finally became angry. It was a silly yarn, and did he imagine he could string her along like that? So Peter, irritated, set out to convince her. He told her about Guffey and the American City Land and Investment Company. He told her about McGivney, and how he met McGivney regularly at room 427 of the American House. He told her about his $30 a week, and how it was soon to be increased to 40, and he would spend it all on her. And perhaps she might pretend to be converted by him, and become a Red also, and if she could satisfy McGivney that she was straight, he would pay her too, and it would be a lot better than working 10.5 hours a day in Isaac and Goldstein's paper box factory. At last Peter succeeded in convincing the girl. She was subdued and frightened. She hadn't been prepared for anything like that, she said, and would have to have a little time to think it over. Peter then became worried in turn. He hoped she wouldn't mind, he said, and set to work to explain to her how important his work was, how it had the sanction of all the very best people in the city, not merely the great bankers and businessmen, but mayors and public officials and newspaper editors and college presidents, and great Park Avenue clergymen like the Reverend de Willoughby Stotterbridge of the Church of the Divine Compassion. And Rosie said that was all right, of course, but she was a little scared and would have to think it over. She brought the evening to an abrupt end, and Peter went home much disconcerted. Perhaps an hour later there came a sharp tap on the door of his lodging-house room, and he went to the door and found himself confronted by David Andrews, the lawyer, Donald Gordon, and John Durand, the labor giant, president of the Seamen's Union. They never even said howdy do, but stalked into the room, and Durand shut the door behind him, and stood with his back to him, folded his arms, and glared at Peter like the stone image of an Aztec chieftain. So, before they said a word, Peter knew what had happened. He knew that the jig was up for good this time. His career as savior of the nation was at an end. And again it was all on account of a woman, all because he hadn't taken Guffey's advice about winking. But all other thoughts were driven from Peter's mind by one emotion, which was terror. His teeth began giving their imitation of an angry woodchuck, and his knees refused to hold him. He sat down on the edge of the bed, staring from one to another of these three stone Aztec faces. "Well, Gudge," said Andrews, at last, "so you're the spy we've been looking for all this time." Peter remembered Nell's injunction. "Stick it out, Peter, stick it out." "What do you mean, Mr. Andrews?" "Forget it, Gudge," said Andrews. "We've just been talking with Rosie, and Rosie was our spy." "She's been lying to you!" Peter cried. But Andrews said, "Oh, rubbish! We're not that easy. Miriam Yankovich was listening behind the door and heard your talk." So then Peter knew that the case was hopeless, and there was nothing left but to ascertain his fate. Had they come just to scold him and appeal to his conscience? Or did they plan to carry him away and strangle him and torture him to death? The latter was the terror that had been haunting Peter from the beginning of his career, and when gradually he made out that the three Aztecs did not intend violence, and that all they hoped for was to get him to admit how much he had told to his employers, then there was laughter inside Peter, and he broke down and wept tears of scalding shame, and said that it had all been because McCormick had told that cruel lie about him and little Jennie Todd. He had resisted the temptation for a year, but then he had been out of a job, and the Goober Defense Committee had refused him any work. He had actually been starving, and so at last he had accepted McGivney's offer to let him know about the seditious activities of the extreme Reds. But he had never reported anybody who hadn't really broken the law, and he had never told McGivney anything but the truth. Then Andrews proceeded to examine him. Peter denied that he had ever reported anything about the Goober case. He denied most strenuously that he had ever had anything to do with the McCormick frame-up. When they tried to pin him down on this case and that, he suddenly summoned his dignity and declared that Andrews had no right to cross-question him. He was a 100% red-blooded American patriot, and had been saving his country and his God from German agents and Bolshevik traitors. Donald Gordon almost went wild at that. "What you've been doing was to slip stuff into our pamphlet about conscientious objectors, so as to get us all indicted." "That's a lie!" cried Peter. "I never done nothing of the kind." "You know perfectly well you rubbed out those pencil marks that I drew through that sentence in the pamphlet." "I never done it!" cried Peter again and again. And suddenly big John Durand clenched his hands, and his face became terrible with his pent-up rage. "You white-livered little sneak!" he hissed. "What we ought to do with you is to pull the lying tongue out of you." He took a step forward, as if he really meant to do it. But David Andrews interfered. He was a lawyer, and knew the difference between what he could do and what Guffey's men could do. "No, no, John," he said, "nothing like that. I guess we've got all we can get out of this fellow. We'll leave him to his own conscience and his jingo god. Come on, Donald." And he took the white-faced Quaker boy with one hand, and the big labor giant with the other, and walked them out of the room, and Peter heard them tramping down the stairs of his lodging house, and he lay on his bed and buried his face in the pillows, and felt utterly wretched, because once more he had been made a fool of, and as usual it was a woman that had done it. End of sections 71 and 72.